have it bright and cheery in here, right? Yeah. Actually, it's good. We need the rain. This is March already. Doesn't it seem like we just started this year? March is a very, very important month to spiritualists because it is when the modern American spiritualism, the doors threw open. Spiritualism, a science, philosophy, and religion of continuous life, based on the demonstrated fact of communication with those who live in the spirit world. That is the definition of spiritualism. And when you read those words, the chills just run down my spine. Because you see, there was this little story that I'm going to tell you about as we sung about stories. The story of how spiritualism began. Spiritualism began and continued to grow. And it first started off in a little hamlet called Hydesville in Rochester, New York. And there was this little alcove where there were several houses, and a gentleman named Dr. Hyde owned one of the houses, and actually the town was named after him. And he rented this out. And the first people he rented this to was a family called the Bell family. Husband and a wife, Mr. and Mrs. Bell. And during the last 3 months of their residence there, they had hired a girl named Lucretia Pulver, to come in and tidy up around. She's about 14, 15 years old. And they hired her to come in and do the things of the house, keep the house clean, do the laundry, those type of things. But she also was there and used that home as for school because it was close to her school. And one day a peddler came by. And back in those days, we couldn't go down to Walmart and buy our fabrics or Joann fabrics, and we couldn't go buy those things very readily. So there was a gentleman who came around and he carried a box. It was this big. And in that box, he had things like threads, some pottery, some kitchen utensils, material, and he would go door to door selling these wares. Well, he came to the Bell house that day, and he was in showing Mrs. Bell his wares, and Lucretia came in. She saw a piece of material that she wanted. And she said to him, you know, I don't have the money for that right now, but if you could come by my father's house tomorrow, he'll pay you for that. And the peddler said, okay, I'll be glad to do that. And so Mrs. Bell sent Lucretia away, said, your services have been wonderful, but I really am not in need of your services anymore. And Lucretia said, okay. So she went back to her house. And a couple weeks had passed. And Mrs. Bell had a change of mind. She said, oh, I changed my mind. I need you to come back. So Lucretia came back. And as she would go to bed at night, she would hear these strange noises. And she had said something to Mrs. Bell about that. And Mrs. Bell said, I know, they've been going on for several weeks now. These noises were so pronounced that they would wake her up. And she heard knocks, and she heard dragging, and she heard thuds. And it got to the point where the Bell family could no longer tolerate it. And it was starting to wear on Mrs. Bell's health. Well, one night, Lucretia decided that there was something down in the cellar. Mrs. Bell had sent her down to get something, and she couldn't find it, so she thought, well, maybe it's in the cellar. And she walked down into the cellar, and she sunk in a hole of loose dirt. And it made her lose her balance. And so she cried out for help. And Mrs. Bell came down and helped her, and she stood up, and she's like, why is all this dirt loose here? Well, don't you just know that within the next couple days, Mr. Bell was filling that in, pulling wheelbarrows in, making sure it was more firm. And the noises continued in the house. And the Bell family decided that was it, and they left. Next family moved in, the Weekman family. And they had an 8-year-old daughter. And not long after they were there, 1 or 2 nights, the sounds once again came back. Knocking and dragging and raps. And their daughter was so afraid she could not sleep in her own room and refused to do so. I mean, can you imagine 8 years old and hearing all these funny things in your room? I can think back to when I was 8 years old, I would have been scared. So the Weekman family moved out. And lo and behold, here comes the Fox family. Mr. and Mrs. Fox and their 2 daughters, Maggie and Katie.